Hi, I'm Sharda.
Hello, I am Shahrin.
So today the three of us are going to talk about this amazing production that we are involved in called Death of an Artist.
But I think first let's just introduce what three of us do, I guess. So Hemang, what do you do?
So I wrote the script that was in a way the starting point of this project.
So basically I am one playing a little bit about a story of mine that is being brought into this play. So recently I just returned back from the UK after my studies, and something happened there, and I decided to share that journey here, hopefully to let others, be inspired to find the strength in themselves.
And I think I was the last part of this wonderful bundle of four, being Kavi, Shahrin, and Hemang. So I'm Sharda, and I'm an actress. I also create theatre, and I was brought in as a co-director with Kavitha to, give a lens onto this world that we're creating. So I think it was really Hemang's grandfather's story, right? You want to tell us a bit about that story?
Yeah, so when I first wrote the script, it was based on the poetry that had been written by my grandfather. So he was a writer, a poet, and a playwright. He wrote in Tamil, and I wanted to write a little bit about his situation because as he grew older, he actually lost his hearing, and as a result, he started retreating from society, and to a certain extent also retreating from his writing. So he stopped writing after a while, and eventually there was the unfortunate onset of dementia. So I wanted to tell that story, but I also wanted to tell it through the lens of his poetry. And then once we started work on that, Kavitha invited me to also perform in this production, much to my shock. But I agreed. And then Shahrin's story became another strand in this, as he was affected by the stories that I was telling and that poetry in narrating his own experience, what had happened to him and how he could relate to the story, and that kind of brought the two narratives together. And then of course Sharda, you came along and provided a creative lens for this.
Yeah, so I think we're dealing with loss of art in that sense. But I think we're always going back to this word called grit, right? Which is intergenerational. And grit, so like Mr. Velu, your grandfather lost his hearing, and Shahrin went through Bell palsy, and how do they continue to move forward despite these losses? How does society view them despite their losses? And I think that's a huge connection to Pancha-Less Lesser, obviously the lesser being the loss, but also how does society view aging through this lens, the loss of youth through this lens. So we've been trying to tie in a lot of themes, which is why we've been working on this for a long time. And I think the work has moved into an interdisciplinary nature, right, Shahrin?
Yes, thanks. So I think it's interesting to have Sharda and Hemang as my co-players in a way that, because I myself, apart from I've been with Maya for the longest time, and I'm trained in the form of having classical Indian dance, which is Bharatanatyam, and alongside with that, my other dance training coming from ballet and contemporary, as well as my roots from hip hop. So in a way, I have a lot of vocabulary in what I would like to choose to express. But interestingly, working with Sharda, who is to me, I think, a physical theatre person, she have different tools and ways of bringing us into this work. Especially we work with viewpointings, which I'm quite abreast with when I was doing theatre works before. Hemang, his language, the way he bring into this work, and then crafting, to craft, because I have a certain part where I have to craft my own script, like a monologue, and we actually set a whole hour to write a very short stanza together. So I think it's only it's only possible when you have people from different arts background coming together, and then we create something together, and to me it's magical because we feel satisfied about it, and we feel there was a magical moment that is being created. So I just felt during this pandemic situation, actually make this connection even more valuable, because this is what I miss in creating the art. And this idea of absence in this work is something that to look out for, because it's kind of like a theme that I think for myself for this chapter is all about.
Maybe you could start with reciting the Tamil poem, and then one of the challenges is how is it even when translated, how will it exist in the space?
மேகத்தாயின் கருப்பையிலே வந்து பிறந்த வளர்ப்பிறையே ஏனோ மேகத் திரைக்குள்ளே ஏகி வெளியே வருகின்றாய். Waxing moon, born from the womb of mother sky, why do you emerge from the cloud curtain? So I have to translate my grandfather's poetry here. To a great extent, I think I didn't just translate but adapted it, right, to various contexts where I am right now, perhaps in my life. And that always is a challenge. I don't know if I'm going for authenticity or whether I'm going towards reviving my grandfather's poetry so that it continues to have resonance and continues to have relevance. But what I find happening is that there always is a kind of inherent adaptation, whenever poetry travels from its space and time. The moment you pen something down and someone else reads it, someone else recites it, it does undergo that translation and it does undergo that adaptation. So while it is a challenge, I think it is a creative challenge, and it is something that is helping us, it's benefiting us, that is constructing something very useful and helpful for us. So in the poem, my grandfather speaks about how, the crescent moon peeps out of the curtain and he wonders why. You could say the same thing about his poetry. His poetry, which is perhaps behind the curtain of language, is now peeping out towards a greater space where those who would never encounter his poetry now perhaps can. And you could ask why, but perhaps you don't have to ask why. This is how it should be with all artwork, with all poetry.
And for you, Sharda, were there any challenges or moments that you would like to share in the process?
Challenges. Well, there were a lot of delightful moments because this type of theatre, interdisciplinary theatre, is the type of theatre that I like to do the most, right? Because it's really, it's very democratic. Everybody has a fair share of what they can say and what they can contribute. But that in itself is the biggest challenge, that even though there's the hierarchy of the traditional directors put in place, the directors are also shared between Kavitha and myself, and we do see the work as collaborative. So in that sense, everybody has a stake. Therefore, what suggestion goes through. So there's a lot of talking. There's a lot of discussion before we actually put an idea on the ground or market. But at the same time, that's why I say that is a delight, and at the same time, I think that's probably been the biggest challenge. And also sort of using the poetry and the poems as a way to link everything together and bringing Shah's experience of Bell palsy and Hemang's grandfather, Mr. Velu's loss of hearing, and finding the connections between these two people has taken us months and months. And then finally, after all this alchemy work, we have come with an understanding. So as much as we offer this to the audience, I do hope the audience knows that this has been brewing so much in our lived experience for many months before it enters the theatre.
Thank you. Do you have something to share? One of your interesting moments.
Right. There were so many interesting moments for me, I must say. But the most interesting moment was actually being in a space where we thought that this would be the space, but it keeps changing. So I always like things when it's being challenged that way. To me, it's interesting because they keep me at the edge of my seat. But you want to talk about a moment that really made me feel elated was being able to bring back a story from my past, which is talking about my granddad, which I never expect to bring in my granddad into this picture, but in a way it happens. And then that was quite like, whoa, I discovered that there's an avenue for this, and it's quite nice, like, to bring back some fond memories about the elderly. And since this work is talking about of the aging population, I felt it's kind of appropriate that I learned something from an elder person. Yeah, it was like an interesting eureka moment for me. Whoa, connection.
If there was one word that you hold close to yourself through the process of less and lesser, what would that be for you, Hemang?
Perhaps the word dignity. I think with the bigger topic of the aging population and the elderly, how we treat them, how they treat themselves, what they expect from society, I feel that, at least when I think of my grandfather, it's perfectly encapsulated in that word dignity. And throughout this production, whenever I thought of, at certain moments, perhaps playing my grandfather or thinking about him, thinking of what he would do, I think that is the word that keeps coming back to me. And just now, Sharda mentioned the word grit. I think the way that my grandfather showed grit was through dignity and his decisions to hold on to his dignity.
Mine would be legacy, because it's what your elders left behind for you to bring forward. It could be a tradition, it could be a culture, it could be simple materialistic stuff, it could be anything, but what they left behind is what as this generation is experiencing, could be good or bad, but mostly to bring you to a position where you have a value to bring it forward into this context.
My word would be listen. From a creative perspective, it's listening to the signs of what the work wants to say, and in that sense is listening to the generations before us of what they've already said, and listening and hearing and receiving and then doing. Do you want to talk a little bit about Lalit's involvement, who is our musician? Because it's been interesting we have this dynamic force of physical theatre and dance and text, and we've also got sound involved. So just before we wrap up our podcast, let's talk about what was your experience with sound and your text?
I think it was very interesting from the start because, my story is about someone who's losing his sense of hearing. So I was very fascinated by how sound, if at all, is going to play into this. But Lalit is great at improvising, and the kind of sounds he uses, they're very textured, they're very interesting, they're very unusual. And I would say that sound very much is a player in this production, and a lot of us reacted to it. We changed certain things and we discovered new things thanks to the soundscape that he created. And he was pretty much creating it like, listening to us and watching us perform. So it was very much a collaboration, and that was a very interesting process.
Yeah, so somehow I'm moderating. my role as moderator has seeped into this process. That's my collaboration. So we should all definitely come watch Pancha, right?
Yes.
Which is happening on 21st to 23rd October. Pancha-Less Lesser. But ours, chapter 3, is 21st to 23rd October. Yes, so we hope to see you
Get your tickets
there.
now.
Hope to see you there.